Hello, thank you all for dialing in today. Happy Friday. We are excited to share with you the latest updates on what is happening in Washington. This is a series that we kicked off last year in December. I'm super excited to have my esteemed colleagues join me today. We've got Chris Campbell and Chris Oates. I would love, actually, why don't we quickly do a quick background? So I'll kick off. I'm Liz Powell. I'm the founder of G2G Consulting. I started 15 years ago. I was a former legislative director in Capitol Hill for a couple different members. And our firm now focuses on full service government affairs, but we do a lot in government funding for entrepreneurs, innovators, high tech, and healthcare. So that's my quick intro. Would love to pass to Chris to do your quick intro.
Which Chris?
Oh, Chris Campbell. Sorry. You're upper in my screen. Sorry, you.
No worries. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Campbell. I currently am the chief strategist at global financial institution called Kroll. Before that was assistant secretary of U.S. Treasury, and before that was a staff director for the U.S. Senate Finance Committee.
And I'm Chris Oates. I am a political risk analyst and run my own political risk consultancy firm called Two Lanterns Advisory. So it's been a busy week for me and all my colleagues, and I'm very happy to be here to share some of that with you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. So there's a lot going on, obviously. So since we last talked in December, they still have not finished the appropriations. So that's still hanging out there for FY22, which is then holding up the FY23 process. It's been punted till March, so we're hoping by end of March that happens. We have heard the rumor that there's agreement among the four corners of top numbers, so hopefully they will get something done, but that's still up in the air. We've got a new Supreme Court nominee announced today, Ketanji Brown Jackson, so that'll be a whole process in the Senate. January employment rose by over 400,000 jobs. But meanwhile, Biden's approval rating has remained very low, I think, of strong concern to the administration. It's been below 50 since August. The disapproval right now is at 52%. Approval is only 42%. So there's dynamics there. We've got elections. Of course, those are never ending, but they're just 9 months away. And there's lots of primaries that are sneaking up on us. Texas is going to kick things off in March. And then in May, followed by June, the rest of the primaries will happen. So there's a lot going on there. There's redistricting. Maps are still getting thrown out in states like Ohio. Most of the states, 38 of them now have their maps set, and then 6 only have 1 rep. So that's not a concern, but there's still remaining states. There's also a lot of things turned out differently than people expected with redistricting. They thought that and retirements that they would favor Republicans, but now they're finding a lot of the redistricting maps are actually favoring more Democrats than they thought. So there's interesting dynamics there. There's retirements, as I mentioned, and that's going to impact both the House and the Senate. There's voting law changes happening on the state level, especially absentee voting, and how's that going to affect the elections. And there's Ukraine, as we all know, that's all over the news today, the stock market, the China response, there's more and more troop deployment. So there's a lot going on. I just thought I'd sort of kick things off with a little bit of stage setting, things to think about. So why don't we start off with Ukraine, which I'm sure is front of mind for everyone with the Ukraine invasion. What does this mean for the economy? What are your thoughts on that? Chris Oates.
Sure. So your Ukraine invasion, and apologies, there was a dog and a baby in the background that I had to attend to briefly. Ukraine invasion for the economy, not a ton at the moment. And that it will, obviously, I should specify, it depends on how long the Russian invasion is, to how long it disrupts and what the sanctions are. Early indications are that the Russian invasion did not go as Vladimir Putin expected. This is, again, extremely early, but that's from a senior U.S. defense official speaking to a reporter. So it may take a while. The major impact on the U.S. economy would be through natural gas, oil if there are sanctions, and then other commodities. But it does seem as if everyone involved is trying to exempt energy from any kind of sanctions. It's not going to be, it could be affected, obviously, in the future, but it does seem as if Europe and the United States are trying to make sure that any sanctions hits Russia exclusively and not blowback on us. So I don't expect there to be a huge impact, but probably some. And we see that with the stock market in the last couple of days. It dropped, then it rebounded. Today, it's about where it was a month ago. So it likely will have some effects, maybe on inflation, maybe on supply chains, certainly in specific areas that require goods that exclusively come from Russia or Ukraine. I think I saw palladium had a large increase in the cost, but it's not going to be, I think, 1973 oil crisis where the entire global economy goes into recession if it does happen. But it obviously will. It may have some impact if your main customers, for example, are German manufacturing firms, and all of a sudden they face higher energy prices. But at least in my opinion, early indications, of course, with that caveat, early indications is a muted economic impact, and mainly through indirect routes.
Sorry, Chris Campbell, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree. I think it really depends on what happens after Ukraine and how long the Ukraine challenge is. If the Ukrainian people stand up and the U.S. government, so many members of Congress now are asking for supplemental appropriations to fund those folks in Ukraine. If the U.S. government steps up that way and finds a way to arm the folks in Ukraine against Russia, this could be a pretty prolonged and entrenched challenge. The longer it goes, the more challenging it's going to be. And if Russia decides to go beyond Ukraine, we're in a completely different cycle. And a couple fears I have, and well founded, I think, is dance around this a little bit because I actually had when I was in government when this happened, but it's not been widely reported. There's Russia launched a cyber attack against Ukraine to kind of figure out what its capabilities were, called NotPetya. NotPetya was unable to be contained in Ukraine and went around the world. And Russia has launched several cyber weapons against Ukraine to soften the ground before it went in. And it's still yet to be unknown how those cyber challenges can maybe rebounded around the world. NotPetya hit American interests a lot, and so if any of those cyber challenges and weapons that were deployed are not contained in Ukraine, you're going to see a draw-in of cyber challenges around the world that could quickly escalate. And then if there's any incursion into any NATO country, we're in a very different environment, which will have a significant economic impact around the world and could be quite significant. The other challenge I think we're seeing, unfortunately, I think it's Bruce, I think it's probably steps in a little bit of the questions you have later, but I think we're seeing, and it's really super unfortunate, but as we're witnessing a change and a fork in history now. Whereas I think that Russia and China are working very closely together, and so I think you're going to see this new emergence over time of a now multipolar world. We're going to have some significant challenges, and that with two governments that do not necessarily want to see the U.S. government survive, and so at least not survive in its current form and the power it projects around the world. And so what we do today and how we posture today, and I know this is weighing heavily on the Biden administration and many members of Capitol Hill, will telegraph the future of the world. And so it's really significant. And so it's why the Biden administration is, as you all know, worked with Treasury and was very heavily involved in sanctions. And so what we try to telegraph right now in Russia and Ukraine and the region has to be enough to be able to be a deterrent and suggest that Americans will protect and defend our interests, but do so in a way that's going to be not incredibly destabilizing, as Oates suggested, that would cause a global oil shock that would be devastating to the worldwide economy. And so it's a really difficult and delicate balance. And so also we're constrained in the United States a lot by what our allies are willing to do. It's been again widely reported that many of our allies were not willing to take Russia off the SWIFT system. So, I think we're a little bit constrained on when that happens. Now that posture changes, I think, with our European allies, the longer this goes and the more at threat they feel. And so we're going to see this play out. But there's, I really believe strongly that we're starting to see the emergence of a new shift in global economic and global power that could be quite could pose a very different as a future for the rest of the world for the for the near and short and near term. So we'll see how it goes, but I think it's how we posture in the next several days and months will be extremely instructive as to what happens in the future.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you were inside those walls. You were at Treasury. You cited that one example of the cyber attack. What's going on in Treasury? What do you think they're doing? Are they doing enough? What more could they do? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, like at times like this, they're working feverishly with their current counterparts of our allied countries. And so right now, it would mostly be Europe and we call the Five Eyes, the five major economies in the world that are favorable in all democracies. And so coming together putting together the hardest and deepest sanctions they can, looking at working with our intelligence, U.S. intelligence and worldwide intelligence to identify those who are closest to Putin, to go in and grab their accounts and freeze their assets, and then sanction them. And those sanctions can be binding. The challenge with sanctions, though, is that they take time. And so, if we're able to build a coalition of countries that have strong economies, let's put this in perspective. The U.S., and U.S. and Russia trade is significant. U.S. and China trade is roughly the same as a little more significant than U.S. and Russia trade, but U.S. and European trade is double that. Either what China does and what we do with Russia. If we can keep our European allies together and have binding sanctions, the Russian economy is going to be crippled. It will cripple over time. It just takes time to do it. And so what Putin has done is, really is putting a death knell in the Russian economy, except if there are new alliances that are created. And so if Russia and China give each other a big hug, and they ally with Iran and North Korea and others that are already sanctioned by the U.S., they will create a little cycle, if you will, a little kind of bubble of economies that can work together. China is not a small economy, and so it will again present a real and significant challenge for us and the U.S. interests in the future.
Yeah, which gets to, do you think the sanctions will really work? I mean, I'm hearing that it takes time, but I'm also hearing, they're getting criticized that they could be doing more sanctions. And then, the Turkey oil business too. Like, do you think it's actually going to work?
Again, over time, sanctions always work. The only reason sanctions don't work typically is you have someone willing to go around them. Right. And so that's the only way that sanctions don't work. And there, again, the real problem is that there is a reciprocal trade with Russia and the European Union. And if it's unfortunately, the sanctions on Russia are going to have a negative impact on the European Union. And so, to the extent that the United States and other governments, friendly governments around the world, can help alleviate those concerns in Europe, is going to be really important. And so that's either supplying them with a little natural gas or trying to find different ways of doing this. Is why you hear a lot of mostly Republicans suggesting that we need to up our supply in the United States so we can actually help to export more to the Europeans, as they have this real challenge that's ahead of them because of U.S. sanctions and worldwide sanctions now. So, but I think it's, this is going to take time, and we're at the very early stages. We don't really genuinely know. The thing with the sanction is you can kind of guess as to how it's going to hit, but it will always have secondary knock-on effects. And so what we don't know is what those are, and we're gonna have to respond as they, it's kind of a whack-a-mole. You're gonna have to, as issues arise, the U.S. government and our allies are gonna have to, address those concerns as they pop up. And so it's, it's gonna be iterative. But it's going to be essential that bloc stay together and maintain those sanctions, because it will be really going to be the only chance, unless the Ukrainians have some way of really digging in and making this a very prolonged challenge for Russia. It's really the only way that Russia's ever going to rethink their posture with Ukraine.
Yeah. And Chris Oates, I know you're the political expert. What's your thoughts on sanctions and the politics of sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sanctions are often seen in Washington or in the popular press as like, this is what we do when we don't like a country or when we disagree with something. Like, this is how we punch back. But, really that is, as Chris Campbell said, what you're trying to do is with a sanction is to damage a different country's economy to the point where the cost benefit ratio of their leader now suggests they should work together. It's one tool to achieve one's political, military, diplomatic aims. And, all of this, Clausewitz said, war is politics by other means. It's, one country trying to get another country to do what it wants. Sometimes you use military force, sometimes you use an economic tool. I think the problem that often happens in Washington today is we're like, oh, this country did something we didn't like, we're going to sanction them. But as Chris Campbell said, the effect of that sanction might take years to implement, might have knock-on effects, might be not effective. So what I'm looking for is, do we have any sanctions that could immediately change Putin's calculus? And I don't think we can, because he's built up a lot of foreign reserves and he seems to be fully committed. So then the question is, well, where's the real center of gravity in the Russian regime? And it's not Putin, it is the oligarchs around him, the bureaucrats around him, those in the Duma. Everyone, even in authoritarian regimes, there is a coalition in power that supports the person in power. The best example of this actually is in the movie Death of Stalin, which is a comedy, but actually showed how the Soviet system worked. If you get enough people at the highest levels who say, we're going to have a change in direction or a change in leader, they can do that. So what I'm looking for is, will there be sanctions that immediately sanction the oligarchs? And not only that, but immediately sanction all those in the Duma, the Russian parliament, and others, for example, rescinding their visas, kicking their kids out of British boarding schools. Because then what you say is, look, the people who truly have the power in Russia are going to pay for this unless Vladimir Putin leaves office or unless Russian tanks go back. Now, that's a very low chance, but basically what we're saying in the US is we are going to use and Europe, we're going to use our economic tools and our ability to control visa authorization as a way of encouraging a coup in Russia. A very low probability, but it might not be a coup. It might be, look, stop the invasion, roll back, have negotiations. But it's a way of us doing that. We haven't done it yet, although you can see there have been some talk about certain oligarchs being put on sanctions list. But really, I haven't seen a lot of discussion of, we're doing this to get the center of power in Russia to change against either Putin or his decision. And until that happens, I don't think we'll have an immediate consequence. It would be, as Chris Campbell says, sanctions that hurt the Russian economy in the long term, and that we see over the next couple of years maybe change the calculus, but that wouldn't affect what's happening today on the ground north of Kiev.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what do you think about how all this impacts the stock market, business decision making? What are your thoughts there, Chris Campbell?
Yeah, look, candidly, it's actually been fascinating to be able to watch this, because I think that the market was baking in and was considering the sanctions to be far greater than they were. Once the president got on the TV yesterday and suggested that, and kind of laid out the list of sanctions, the market rebounded quite quickly. So I can think that it's a very interesting question with a very long answer. So I'm gonna try to truncate as best I can. Leaving out the Russia-Ukraine challenge, the economy was going to go through a very bumpy challenge this year. We had very high inflation. The Federal Reserve is going to have to step in and do some things that are going to be just that anything they do is going to be market distorting, and going to cause quite a lumpy and bumpy year economically, as we try to get inflation under control. Now you layer in a war, and the destabilizing effect of that, which is going to cause inflation because you see oil and natural gas already rising, which is going to have an inflationary impact. But the problem with that inflation compared to the inflation that we had prior to the Russian conflict is that interest rates are not going to change that. So there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do that would impact global oil challenges, because there's just a supply challenge. And so the Federal Reserve now and the U.S. government have this what was already a very difficult economy to get under control, and inflation to get under control has become now compounded, factoredly different. It's become a much harder concern. And so I always say I don't envy my friend Jay Powell's job. I really don't envy his job, because he can do what he can do that will affect the four corners of our economy, and perhaps would alleviate some of the supply chain challenges we see, and other issues that the Federal Reserve can do. But there's a lot now that's out of his control. And so what many people were thinking that perhaps we were going to see a couple rate changes this year. Most people are going to back off on that, because really there's going to be so much uncertainty, and so little the Federal Reserve can do on that side of the aisle, on that side of the fence, that's anyway indirectly impacted in this conflict, that the economy's going to have to find a new stabilize. Whatever the economy is going to do is going to react to this conflict, and it's going to. I think we're going to start continue to see inflation and all those other issues. The Federal Reserve is going to have to start making its moves with that. It's probably going to be either after the Q2 meeting or maybe at the Q3 meeting to make some bigger moves. I don't anticipate that there's going to be a rate increase, not a significant rate increase now, because there's just so many things that are unknown that's going to go on. The reality is that the economy was going to be in a challenge this year. Short answer to those in business, economy is going to go through a real challenge this year anyway. It's now going to get even more challenging.
Yep. Chris Oates, do you have other thoughts to add to that one?
Yeah, and I just think Chris Campbell spoke about the Federal Reserve, and then when we think about what the White House would do to deal with economic problems and to deal with inflation, they're obviously going to continue trying to do that, and the departments that are managing that are going to continue to try to doing that. But at the highest level, and for a lot of departments, they now have other concerns. You can't expect Joe Biden to be in meetings about how are we going to unravel the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach when Russia's invading Ukraine. He has to be in those meetings as well. So I mean, the federal government is big. There are a lot of people still working on these things, and I know in Congress there are a lot of people still, to what extent they would have been doing something with fiscal policy or with various laws or administrative actions, sure. But their attention is going to be divided, certainly at the highest level. The principal's attention is going to be divided significantly with Russia. So it's not to say it will necessarily get worse, but maybe certain things we would have expected to see won't happen, or they'll get pushed off for a few weeks or a few months.
Mm-hmm. So, and what about Congress? Their response to Ukraine and their response to the situation overall? What do you think, Chris Oates?
Well, so from what we've seen, there is calls for some supplementary military spending. I could see a bill passing much sooner rather than later, that authorizes a significant amount of military expenses for aid to Ukraine, sending them defensive weaponry, extra military spending for deployments to Eastern countries in NATO. And that's, on one hand, it's fine, it's useful, but if Russian tanks are in Kyiv tomorrow and there's a puppet regime in by next week, well, Congress coming back and passing military aid isn't going to do a lot. So I think when we're looking at what's going to happen in Ukraine, if Russian tanks get bogged down and if there's a lot of fighting and it goes on for a series of months, then this will become very important, because it would mean that we are doing in Ukraine what we did in Afghanistan in the 1980s, funding an insurgency, which will have, we spoke just a few minutes ago, all of the consequences of Russia being knocked out of the global system. Perhaps at that point there are damages to natural gas and oil to Europe. Maybe I know Ukraine. There's not a ton of natural gas and oil transversing through Ukraine from Russia to Europe. But if there's a war that goes on for the next few months, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some Ukrainian militia units who try to blow up some stuff. So and that I think matters not just for what's going on there, but if Congress is now concerned with that, it means that other domestic agenda items won't actually be addressed as well.
Yeah. Yeah, which leads me to my next question. So we're going to shift. I know Ukraine is front of mind, but let's shift a bit to the infrastructure bill, Build Back Better. So they did this infrastructure bill in a bipartisan way. It's now been many months since then. So what's happening on the ground? Is it popular? Are people seeing that was a great law? Or is it getting buried under so many other things happening? And what's happening with Build Back Better? Is that ever going to happen at this point? What do you think, Chris Oates?
So the infrastructure law, so it's passed, and from a political impact, it is popular, but it's not going to change a lot of people's votes. Also, the political effect of it is muted by the fact that everyone seems to be taking credit for it. You may have seen various tweets from members of Congress who voted against it and then are tweeting, hey, to the good folks of this district, I have secured this and this and this, and we now have this. And you'll see governors, a lot of governors are now going to whenever there is anything, the governor will be there, even if the governor didn't support this. They obviously didn't vote for it, but if you have a Republican governor in a state who's taking credit for infrastructure spending that was funneled through the state, that means the political impact is muted. So I don't think and this is something I remember all of last year, not really understanding why Democrats thought that an infrastructure bill was going to be the thing that would, make people go out and dance in the streets. It was going to be a popular bill, but it wasn't going to turn a lot of heads. And in fact, what was really interesting, there was a fascinating interview with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who spoke about how she attributed this to groupthink within the Democratic Party. And there was one quote she had where she was in the room, senior members of Democratic leadership almost talking themselves into the necessity of passing an infrastructure this week. And it was before the Virginia gubernatorial elections. And you may have seen in the news people saying, we, the Democrats in Congress, need to pass the infrastructure bill so that Terry McAuliffe can win the Virginia governor's race, which to me is it's bad political analysis, because there's not a ton of connection between, passing the infrastructure bill and that. Build Back Better might be different, depending on what's in it. I do think there's going to be something that will eventually be called Build Back Better. It will likely be around 1.7 to 1, just a guess, 1.7 to 1.8 trillion dollars, which is what Joe Manchin had agreed to back in last August. It's likely to have a large climate component, some sort of social care component, whether that's pre-K or childcare or something like that, likely something around healthcare. And then it might also have something about debt reduction, because Joe Manchin seems to really want that. But if I had to guess, I would say that this will pass. There is a question about why it hasn't passed already. I mean, I would guess that maybe Chris Campbell knows, but I would assume that there have been meetings going on for the last few months to try to figure out what Manchin will vote for. That was delayed in January because of the switch to voting rights. And then in February, it looks like Russia's taken up a lot of attention. Also, people might not be aware, but there is a Democratic senator who had a stroke recently, who is not, there's no real rush to get anything into the Senate right now because he wouldn't be there to vote for it. So if I had to guess, I would say that sometime in March or April, there would be something that is going to be called Build Back Better that will pass, that will contain some of those elements.
Great, interesting. Okay, Chris Campbell, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that I'm a little more bearish on Build Back Better. So I think that there is. I think it'll be a smaller package. I think it'll be something that I do agree with Oates that there'll be the Democrats are going to have to try to do something on a reconciliation that's something they call Build Back Better. My guess is going to be much smaller in scope, and it will probably put not to bore everyone, but there's two. there's an international tax agreement that was led by Treasury that has two pillars, one a digital sales tax and kind of one a global minimum tax that we now are under obligation per the Biden administration this negotiation with our kind of global partners. And so we need to kind of meet those obligations. And so that my guess is there'll be some international tax components that pay for whatever it is that they put together that's Build Back Better. The great challenge with this is, and it's I know it's always very frustrating for folks outside of Washington, but it's whatever is in that package is going to have to be incredibly well pressure tested politically, because you're going to have, because it will be partisan. And so whatever is in that package, the opposite side, right now, it'd be the Republicans, will find something in that package that they will run campaign ads against. And so it's just going to be it's a very, very challenging time. Now, the Russian challenge may give them some air cover to be able to get something and put something together that would be not as front and center and kind of leading the CNN, the news. But I think they have to put something together because it's such an important component of the Biden administration's agenda. But the smaller, the better to contain the political risk of a large package. The larger the package, a la Obamacare, there will be something in the package that the party in power will they'll just miss, and the other side will find. And so that's just going to be one of the major challenges. And so my gut tells me it'll be a smaller package, something they can claim credit on, perhaps do some international tax reform to pay for it and get underway. The other thing that I would put on I think there's going to be an event forcing action on some defense spending coming up really soon, as Oates suggested. And so that may be a vehicle that would be something they could probably maybe put this on. And there'll be some huge challenges politically for that. But it will kind of grease the gears, if you will, in Congress to get something done and create some momentum legislatively on some things that may get passed.
Right. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, given everything that's happening, very partisan levels in both chambers right now also. Do you think that other legislation is going to be able to get done? I mean, it ranges from like FDA user fees to this ARPA-H new huge, that's a big ticket item to do new innovation for health technologies. Like other legislation, do you think other legislation is going to be able to get through Congress, or is it just going to be these big items with the Ukraine and with a supplemental bill, et cetera? Like what's your take on that? I guess Chris Oates.
Yeah, I think that I can't remember what the acronym is off the top of my head now, but the old Open Skies one that passed the Senate in 2021, it's now in the House. I think that's going to go through without much of a problem because there doesn't seem to be any opposition. It does seem as if the reason it didn't pass was just that people didn't prioritize actually like taking up the floor time for it. But I wouldn't be surprised if you had things like that are relatively bipartisan, that are either have some kind of connection to innovation, improving the economy to compete with China, or defense, that does go through. The best term for this actually is Matt Iglesias, who's a writer, he calls it secret Congress. He says there's Congress like Build Back Better that everyone focuses on and campaigns on, and then there's secret Congress where like a bunch of representatives and senators say, oh yeah, we support this, we'll pass it. And I think there's going to be a number of things like that do pass this year because they don't hurt anyone politically. They give everyone a little bit of help, but again, they're so bipartisan that they can go through without too much of a hassle, in part because they're not going to get a lot of airtime on CNN anyway.
Yeah, Chris Campbell, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think what typically happens in those environments, I've been around a lot and done a lot of these, is to put together some very small package that punts into the lame duck. So if there's anything that's controversial that's must pass before now and then, I think you'll largely see kind of a kicking the can down the road, which Congress is amazingly good at doing, to the lame duck, and the committees will work between now and then very quietly to get something done. Suggesting Congress, I think, will likely have a different makeup of Congress next year. And so, I think that thought will be given to that, but they'll try to find ways of getting some stuff done that are, again, if there's anything controversial at all, except Build Back Better, that's, again, Democrats are going to have one package, so one bill that they can do in reconciliation. And that'll probably be something like Build Back Better. But anything absent that, and if there's any controversy, which is going to be most things, will be kicked down the road until December.
Well, you mentioned it, so let's go there. Elections. What do we think is going to happen with the elections? How's that going to impact things? We do have a question here about capital gains, if we see the impact in response to the election results. So what do you think is going to happen with elections? How are things playing out? Chris Oates.
So the baseline scenario is that Republicans take back the House, probably take back the Senate, although because Senate maps are more, it's not every state at the same time. And there is possible that Democrats do pick up a seat or two in the Senate while losing the House. So that's the baseline. There are a few things that complicate that baseline. One is that redistricting has been better for Democrats than has been expected. There was the expectation that they would lose the House purely through redistricting. There would be no change. You could have no change in any votes, and redistricting would cost them the House. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. The House maps may be slightly skewed Republican, depending on how they all turn out, but it won't be as much as was originally thought. But then again, the president's party nearly always uses seats, so that's why we expect it. The complications, though, are that we don't know what's going to happen with the war in Ukraine. We don't know what's going to happen with other things like Supreme Court cases. We don't know where the economy is going, what's happening with Omicron. So I would say this is, it's a baseline scenario that Republicans take the House, but with a very wide range of possibilities. I wouldn't put all my money on that. And I think that, a big question is, does this actually turn out to be a 2002 type midterm elections, where if there is a war, the incumbent party can use that to their advantage? I mean, if I were a Democratic strategist or ad maker, I would have that clip of Donald Trump saying Putin is a genius on every single one of my ads. I would show my candidate's opponent. I would show my candidate saying I support Donald Trump, and I would show Donald Trump saying Putin's a genius. The other thing is that I would use in ads is Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, put out his 11-point agenda, which to me is one of the most politically maladroit documents out there, because he says everyone should have some skin. He calls it skin in the game, but meaning pay some income taxes. So you can spin that as he's going to raise taxes on tens of millions of Americans. He also had a thing where there should be no federal employee who earns more than 5 times the median income, which would be $179,000. Nearly every doctor in the VA earns more than that. So you could put in an ad, this person is going to gut the VA. And it's one of those documents that the reason I mention this as being politically damaging is that it's one of those documents no one actually expects to turn into legislation. It's a platform that one senator who likely has ambitions for 2024 in the presidency put out. So it was never going to be like an actual legislative package, but it's fodder for attack ads. So is there the possibility that Democrats put a ton of attack ads, that the war in Ukraine turns into something much worse? Absolutely. There's also the possibility that inflation gets worse, the war in Ukraine is over, and they lose a lot of seats. I think absolutely too. So it's a long way of saying baseline is that Republicans take the House, but really anything could happen.
Yeah, Chris Campbell.
So I'm usually I like by nature, my DNA, I'm a bipartisan person. So, but I'll give you the other side of the coin just because it needs to be said. But I think that the Republicans also are preparing ads about, when Biden was running for president, that Putin would never do this because he was, he's scary and as capable. That's obviously not happened. The reality is we're seeing it, just what happens. It just absent a war, and I think that what Chris Oates said is right, which could kind of change the environment a bit. But the president's party always does really, really poorly in a midterm election, the first midterm. And then just kind of a little bit of my orientation, because I'm more of an economic kind of person, but people typically vote on their pocketbooks, and it's just mostly what happens. And so, unfortunately, really unfortunately, but I think that we're going to continue to see inflation, and so people are going to be able to their dollar is going to go farther. And that's going to be a really significant challenge for most American families. And I think that's likely, put the social wars and the kind of everything else of the wars, the real wars, or the Supreme Court or whatever it is that's out there. People just generally vote on pocketbook issues. And I was about to Bill Clinton, where he said his economy is stupid, and almost always that's what really moves the needle during campaigns. And most forecasts suggest that we're going to be in a recessionary period going into November. So that's just going to be a real challenge for any incumbent party. If the Republicans, they'd get slaughtered. If it's Democrats, they're going to get slaughtered. And I think likely because Democrats now control Washington, there's going to be a real bloodbath. It's going to be a significant wave election.
Yeah. So what about the presidency? How would you guys size it up? And what are the key factors on the path to, the next election, and who's going to fill the White House then? And we've got Trump back on the stage, actually never really left the stage, but so what do you think? How do you size up the presidency? What are your thoughts on the president? Chris Campbell.
So I worked with him in the Senate. I worked with him as vice president. I really like the president. He's a very personally likable guy. There's just a lot of challenges that face this White House. You can unpack them and just kind of suggest how we got here or why we got here, but the reality is we're here. And so we have, perhaps a three-front war coming. Iran and China and Russia are all kind of breathing down our necks. The economy is in a really, really, really unstable place. And there's this great unrest in our country. We're deeply divided. And so there's just a lot of challenges. I hope and pray that the president is able to get his arms wrapped around this, the administration is able to do this. I don't see a lot of momentum in that direction. I'm quite concerned about it. And so I'm an American. I want any president of the United States to win, right? And we need, as a country, we need to win. American values, I think, are the best in the world. And so, and to project that strength. And so I'll do whatever I can to help in the challenge, but there are a lot of challenges. And we're just, unfortunately, I think there's just not been a lot of movement, at least from my perspective, in a direction that's demonstrating American exceptionalism. And so, again, we have time. We have time to fix those issues, but I think it's demonstrated and it reflects in the negative poll numbers.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and I think that first of all, I think it's too soon to say who's going to be the president in 2025. Not only because we don't know which party is going to win, but also we don't know necessarily who's going to run. It could be that Joe Biden chooses not to run. I know that he said that he is planning to run, but he is pretty old. And there's always the chance that, there's either a health scare or his advisors say, look, we don't think you can do another 4 years. Vice President Harris is clearly making steps to build up for a run. I think as every vice president does. I think, the job of the vice president is you do what the president asks you to do, and then you also plan for your own presidential run. I think Transportation Secretary Buttigieg is also clearly laying groundwork. I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't a couple governors out there who are, making calls and just making sure everyone knows that they're available. I'd say most of the Senate probably is doing the same. So what we could have happen is that, at least on the Democratic side, next January or February, President Biden says that he's not going to run for a second term. And this could be, I'd say, extend anywhere up to really the Iowa caucuses in early 2024, where he says he's not going to run. And then all of a sudden you see a wave of people enter on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, we also don't know who's going to run. It looks like former President Trump is going to run. It looks like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is almost certainly going to run. I would also say, if former President Trump doesn't run, you're going to see a lot more also come out. So it's hard to predict just because we don't know necessarily the partisan lean of 2024, and we don't know who the candidates will be. But I think what we will see over the next few years, as Chris mentioned, is the White House trying to improve the country. And so if they're successful, you're more likely to see the Democrat try to ride their coattails, the Republican maybe attacking them for certain policies. And if they're unsuccessful, you might see a Democrat who's running kind of against the White House, or in a sense against the existing Democratic establishment, and a Republican, perhaps it was more from the establishment side of the Republican Party, because you run a typical, I'm a Republican in a Republican year. So we don't know, but I think what those kind of trends are the things to look at for who's likely to take over after 2024.
Yeah. All right. So if you could give advice to Congress, the White House, tell them what key things they should be doing to turn things around, get back on track, whether it's COVID, which we haven't even talked about yet, but Russia, the economy, obviously, as Chris Campbell said, it's the economy stupid. What would be your advice that you would give to get things back on track? And why don't we start with Chris Oates?
Well, I mean, first of all, Chuck Schumer, when he had that agreement with Joe Manchin last summer about what Build Back Better would look at, he probably should have given that to Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, because apparently he did not share that with anyone else. So for the 4 months of negotiation, I truly do not know what his strategy was. I don't know if he had a strategy. I don't know if it was just pure forgetfulness. But yeah, they should sit down and figure out what is Build Back Better, what does everyone agree on, and then just pass it. I'd say that is the most important thing. When it comes to Russia, certainly a supplemental aid, likely some diplomacy around how to peel off China from the Russia axis, how to make sure that India doesn't join with Russia. We've seen that the Prime Minister of Pakistan was in Russia recently. Iran has seemingly kind of not joined Russia, but at least given them cover. So that's something to look at. But then I think, as Chris Campbell mentioned, the economy is a significant challenge. So work on fixing supply chains, work on if there are certain things that you could do or certain bills to do, or that innovation package that's sitting in the House, pass that. But I think ultimately there's a limited amount of action that the White House or Congress can take just in general about the economy. But to the extent that there are actions, they should be doing that rather than what I'm guessing they had been doing in December, which is going back and forth in the press about what they want to put in Build Back Better without consulting with Joe Manchin what he actually thought about. So that would be the most important thing.
Yeah. Chris Campbell.
It's complicated for me because I've traditionally been a Republican. So I think that there's in times like this, I think that the government always has the inclination to spend more. That will, with my orientation, that would cause greater inflation. And so I think they need to kind of fight that challenge. Be very, very targeted in what they do. We are going to have some significant challenges in energy. I think some targeted action on that would be could be quite significant. It may alleviate some of the concerns on inflation. And then I think you have it's a real challenge. The momentum right now is just in a negative way. The reality is there's almost nothing Congress can do today that's going to affect the economy in this year. So there's almost nothing it can do. Only thing it can do is authorize incredible new spending, which will, as we've seen, will cause inflation. It'll accelerate inflation, and so it can. The Federal Reserve can continue pumping money. It can keep rates low, and Congress can continue to supplying new capital to the economy. But the reality is that's going to it will elongate perhaps the expansion. The economy is supposed to fail every 10 years. We're now around 15 years. We're for 5 years post what would be a normal correction. Congress and the Federal Reserve can act together, so on fiscal and monetary policy, to elongate that expansion. You could do that, but it will cause the correction to be much harder, much harder, and whatever whatever the Federal Reserve or whatever that does to put their arms around that, to me, much more challenging. That's one way that you could go. I don't know. That means the reality is, I think that opening up new markets is always important. Maybe perhaps looking at new and different tax structures. I think that it's become a partisan talking point, and I wish it wasn't. It's largely involved in environmental challenges, but American independence for oil and natural gas is incredibly important. Now, I think that we need to transition to greener energy, but there is that transition period, and for us to be now reliant upon foreign sources when there's a global conflict is a real challenge. I think it's very unwise. And so I think that there's those things that I would do, but it's that's the Democrats taking on very important constituencies they know they're not going to do. So that those are some of the challenges I think we need to, and then really dial back in a smart way, but significantly dial back mandates and things that are COVID related that I think are going to prove to be very, very challenging for Democrats in November, and to kind of dial them back in a smart way, and then kind of reopen the economy as it's going to reopen, and let it find its new normal.
Yeah, that's a huge factor. So we're getting a couple of questions here. What about patent reform? I know that was legislation has come. It's been very cyclical. It keeps coming and coming and then never quite gets through. So what do you think about if you have thoughts on patents right now and sort of this innovation economy? Oh, sorry, Chris Campbell.
Sorry, recall the question again on the patents.
Yeah. Like there's been patent reform legislation introduced and reintroduced. And then there's just sort of the innovation economy overall. Just any thoughts on that and what you think might happen?
Yeah, like as many people know, I worked on Senate Judiciary Committee for a long time, and that's as a committee that has primary jurisdiction over intellectual property rights issues. The challenge is that there is on intellectual property rights, there just is no uniform answer. Trademark, copyright, and patent have their own different paths, and it's very hard to put them under one umbrella. The patent challenges specifically, typically what the biggest patent things out there, typically that are the largest drivers of the economy, at least, are pharmaceuticals and biologics. That's typically the largest drivers for patents. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, there's a great debate in Washington about price controls on generic and generic issues, both in biologics and pharmaceuticals, which cause a consensus to be any consensus that would be gained on patent reform to make it very hard and very challenging, because it gets caught up in those other kind of ancillary debates. And so it's really, really hard. I worked for quite some time with a senator who's now retired, Orrin Hatch, who was the author of the Hatch-Waxman Act, also the author of the Generic Biologics Act. So we were able to kind of get a consensus over many in years to have that patent, the patent challenges and changes made in both in biologics and pharmaceuticals. But it took a long time to get there, and so I think we're on a long path again to get to some patent reform. But intellectual property rights, there's just a significant challenges, and it's going to be very hard to find a consensus in an election year on issues that are that have such a humongous economic impact, but also are deeply embedded in some very political challenges that are going to be driving the debate in November.
Yeah, very, very helpful insights there. Chris Oates, what do you think?
No, I agree. Chris Campbell is the expert on patents.
Yes. All right. So I'm seeing another question on failures on the federal level. Due to failures on the federal level, are there any thoughts on dynamic within states and their effort to better meet consumer needs? For example, federal agencies losing their authority and credibility. Do you have thoughts on that question, Chris Campbell?
Yeah, look, so I think there's any time that the federal government fails, or there is a lack of consensus and lack of effectively the federal institutions have failed. So Congress is unable to get to consensus on anything. What typically happens is like it's a balloon. You push on one side, the other side comes up. The work shifts over to the regulators that are absent Congress and to the states. And so I think, we've already seen that shift in the states and state legislatures around the country, doing many things that change their either election systems or their economies or the tax regimes or that kind of thing, and try to find a way to attract the great migration of people that have been moving around because of COVID. Some states are beneficiaries, some states are losers, and they're going to see this significant shift now. The regulators, should November happen the way many people are thinking it's going to happen, and the Republicans regain control of either house, they're going to have gridlock in Washington. And so then in Washington, the real work's going to be shifting over to the regulators. And so I think that's what's going to happen. I think you're going to see that shift. They're already seeing that shift happen. And so I think the governors around the country their profile are going to be raised, and they're going to have these kind of these challenges. In which I love this, because this is what makes America great. Really, one of our most fascinating things is you have these 50 state laboratories that can really test and pressure test these ideas. And I think we'll have some time now to really have those ideas and some birth of some new and perhaps genius ideas that the federal government that can consume and subsume when it can get back to legislating.
Chris Oates, what do you think?
Well, I think I agree, but I'll also say that there's, in parallel to that, there's a more pessimistic take, which is that states are both laboratories of democracy, but as one political science scholar has said, laboratories of autocracy as well. Because if states are less competitive, and there are many states that are much less competitive due to the nationalization of politics, and if state media, the press covering a state house has declined, we get the potential for there to be corruption in states, for there to be no real connection between popular approval and what state actors do. And we say, I know, was in your state of Ohio, was it the Speaker of the House who was convicted of bribery for some law that was basically, an entrenched interest? I believe it was a coal factory, some sort of power utility that said, we want to make sure that we keep getting money. We'll bribe a state official, and they'll pass a law that protects us. And you've seen in other states around the country, there be laws that, and this is not just now, but historically, that have driven away businesses or helped the folks who donate to the people in charge. Because if you are not running in necessarily competitive elections, you want to make sure that you make it through your primary, and you make it through your primary through having a bigger war chest than any potential opponent. So I think that is absolutely true that it may be gridlock in Congress leads to some states adopting brilliant ideas and brilliant policies. It may also lead to other states propping up dying industries or doing things that help out the pockets of the folks in charge. I think it was actually Cincinnati, 1/3 of their city council is now under indictment by the FBI for corruption charges. So I would say, just to any business out there when looking to relocate, definitely pay attention to the political structure of the place you're looking at, and think, is this a place where I, as a new business, have a fair shot? Or is it one place where, I think the speaker or the Senate president or the governor, generally people's in the legislature, because they have smaller constituencies to appeal to, are going to pass policies that actually hurt me and lock me out? So it's definitely, we do have 50 states, and they're not all made alike.
Yeah, definitely pros and cons, lots of nuances with this. This has been such a great discussion. Thank you both. Really appreciate your expertise and your time today. And thank you all for dialing in to listen. We have recorded. We'll send you the link in case you want to listen to it again or share with others. And stay tuned. We are doing this on a quarterly basis. So with that, we will say goodbye. Have a great weekend. Thank you.